So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Really happy to have you here. We want to spend a little bit of time just giving you some information about a process that we went through at City of Seattle. There's a lot of information, and I just hope that it's something that in the end will be useful for you to take back.
And so before we get started with the day, we did a little bit of this morning, as we do want to take time to recognize and honor the indigenous land and the sovereign land that we are on. And we also want to have you all take a moment, and it's going to be 60 seconds of your time, to really plant yourself, close your eyes if you are able, relax your person, and just take 60 seconds to set your intention of why you're here in this session right now, why you're here today, and what is your why in doing this work. So just think about that, close your eyes, I will keep time, and just breathe. And come back and join me in one large inhale together, and exhale. Thank you. We like to get started with a lot of that just to really have us get centered, come back from where we are, and really engage our brains differently. To really bring back where we are with learning and coming into the space together. So with that, we'll start with a quick introduction. My name is Dr. Andrea Ramirez, and there's some feedback there. I will not stand there.
So I have to interrupt her and say affectionately referred to as Dr. Drea in our office.
Which I respond to. And so we just like to get started a little bit about sharing a little bit about us to really ground this work of who we are and why we come to this work. And so I am from an amazing family, an amazing mother who we have a military background. My father was in the military, my parents divorced, and so a lot of it was also from a strong, independent mother who raised children by herself while my dad was always in service. I am Latina, I am Mexican, I am Chicana, and I am less than 1% of women that look like me that get a doctorate. And that is part of my journey. I am first in the family to take on a lot of the educational journey of higher education in 3 degrees, in lots of debt, in working 3 jobs and over the summers just to pay my way and my books to be in spaces where I did not see people like me. I did not have people that taught the classes that looked like me. And so my journey of even getting this degree that does not make me any more valid than anybody else's lived experience, but it was a path that I know means something for folks that share community with me and identity with me, to see other folks like them. That is part of my journey. I hold a lot of privilege in that. And I am constantly brought back to my work because of the children in my family, my niece, my nephew, knowing that my road of being the only person in a lot of, whether it's director spaces and in my fields that I've worked in, and not seeing folks even in the entire organization that look like me, knowing that I want their futures to look different, and I want someone or a path of many people to be in those spaces so they feel from the get-go that they belong and they have access to so many things without having to set up and find out what battle am I engaging in today to survive and heal my own survival. So that is where I come to in this work. And I thank you for having me. My pronouns are she and her. And then we'll let you meet a little bit of Felecia.
So first of all, I really want to apologize that if you have a program and it has all that text about who I am, I really thought they were going to cut some of it out. I didn't expect them to put all that in there. So I want to apologize if you had to go through that. And I'm not actually going to talk about any of that. The way that I introduce myself is with a poem that is called Where I'm From. And I actually read it because I would be tempted to change it every time I read it. So I'll read it to you. I am from homemade clothes, from off mosquito repellent and Jergens lotion. I am from the housing projects with wide open spaces and lots of kids playing in the snow, in the sunshine. I am from a field of dandelions, which were once buttery yellow, then halo white, and set free with a strong breath. I'm from fishing trips and friendly competitions of every sort, from Mary and Sue and Mimi, from the tellers of tall tales and professional cooks, from you better be home when the street lights come on, and don't you dare come home without your little brother or sister. I'm from 3 generations of family church duets. Jesus, he will fix it after a while. I'm from the wrong side of the river in a small Michigan town, by way of down south, by way of slave ships from Mother Africa, from greens grown in the family garden, and enough sugar and butter to take a body down. I'm from great-grandpa Alex, who came north to avoid being lynched for allegedly stealing from a white man. And from Mama, a high school dropout who alone raised 3 children while getting not 1, not 2, but 3 college degrees. I'm found in boxes that await digitization in my storage, pulled out by the sun with an artistic eye to post on Facebook on Throwback Thursdays, while the practical daughter hangs the family art, uses the crystal lamps, and I hide the misappropriated silver in the bottom drawer. Thank you. I share that because it does give you some indication of how I came to this work and the work that I'm doing. A lot of struggle, much like Dr. Andrea, the mom who independently tried to bring up her 3 children, 2 boys, thank God, did not end up in gangs, did not end up on drugs, did not end up in prison, something that's way too familiar. And yet then there are all of the stories where that's not true and you don't hear a lot about them. So this is kind of the basis of my work, growing up in housing projects, being usually the only one or one of only 2 in the college-bound courses, as opposed to getting you into some kind of shop or vocation. And so it is important to me that when we look at people, talk to people, interact with people, that they are people first, that we see them in their humanity before we see any other part of them. Having said that, I'm going to talk. Question.
Having said that, I would like you all to introduce
Okay.
yourself to somebody sitting next to you who you do not already know.
She is the boss.
I have the clicker. So introduce yourself, but also share.
Hold on.
Okay, you're all like ready to jump into this?
It's too late.
That's okay.
You lost.
Introduce yourself and share your why. Why you do this work. You have now met one of your new best friends. Hopefully you'll be engaged and get to connect with them a little bit more after this or during the session. So with that, we are going to try to incorporate a little bit of a connection, but we do have a case study, which is a lot of talking about something we did. And Felecia is going to frame all of that up of how we do workforce equity at the City of Seattle.
So within the City of Seattle, about 14, 15 years ago, it's probably about 15 years ago now, a person who was running for mayor went around the City of Seattle and met with community groups in a lot of different spaces. And he asked the question, how is the city working for you? And no matter where they were or how they cut it in any other way, white folks said, it's working for me pretty well. People of color, not so much. So he went on to be elected. And when he was elected, he then worked with our Department of Human Services and said, we need to put something together that we can deal with institutional and structural racism in the city. And it was named Race and Social Justice Initiative. There are those of us who are upset that it still says initiative after 14 years because it should be what is baked into everything that we do. But RSJ, as we called it, went along for quite a while, and we started out by training all of our employees, or at least having them have a facilitated viewing of Race, the Power of an Illusion, so they could understand the basis of where this was coming from, the history behind it, the fake science, all of that. And when we had sufficiently, we felt, trained our employees, it then turned externally to the services that the city provides. But along the way in there, workforce equity, how we treated our own employees, kind of got lost. And then it was probably 6 years ago when there was an article in the paper that said, guess what? City of Seattle pays women less than men at worse rates than any one big city in the country. And the mayor's office and council threw up their hands. We got to do something. We got to do something. And those of us who had been working on race and social justice all those years said, we need to do something about race. And so what started as a gender equity journey was in fact turned back into race and social justice from workforce equity standpoint. And when that happened, they gave us a little time to come up with a workforce equity strategic plan. And one of the first things that we were supposed to do was come up with a definition for workforce equity. And that is how we got to where this is. So, workforce equity is when the workforce is inclusive of people of color, because we always lead with race in the city, and we lead with race because of the impacts, of course. And other marginalized or underrepresented groups at a rate representative of the greater Seattle area. So this is the representation part. The greater Seattle area we defined as King County. And we did that because only about half of our employees actually live within the city limits, and people are moving out of the city who can't afford to be there. And the people that we serve aren't all residents of the city of Seattle. So we used the greater Seattle area, and also King County had a more diverse base than the city by itself. So we looked at King County as the greater Seattle area. And of course we said at all levels of city employment. Why? If you just go strictly on representation and a percentage, we meet the percentage of people of color for the city of Seattle as employees. But they're located in the lower levels of jobs for the most part. So we wanted to make sure that this was at all levels of city employment, and where institutional and structural barriers impacting attraction, where we're recruiting, selection, who's getting hired or promoted, participation, that has a whole range of things. It has to do with your training, it has to do with discipline, it has to do with leave, whether you take leave or not, it has to do with all of those kinds of things. And of course retention, because we want to keep the people who are really dedicated to doing good in the city for other people. That we eliminate all of those barriers to enable opportunity for employment success and career growth. So that is our long definition of workforce equity, and that is what we work from. I did not share, it is in the information, that as the workforce equity director at the city of Seattle, my job primarily is to oversee the workforce equity strategic plan and how it is in fact implemented or not, as well as any projects that happen to get thrown our way. And we'll talk about one of those.
And so a little bit of what we're going to talk about today, you have these in your booklet, but we wanted to share. We're going to talk a little bit about the process of us engaging in an organization-wide work group, and specific for today, talking about recommendations related to anti-harassment and discrimination. We're also going to talk a little bit about equity, race, and social justice in developing a shared result, and what does that mean, and actually embedding it in the entire process and all the work that we did. And we're going to hopefully share some strategies with you that you can potentially use or adapt or learn from and grow with our times with you today.
So why this topic? We do need to have workforce equity as our North Star for our employees. We want to make sure that everything that we do is to create more equitable practices. We're a long way from it. We all know that this is hard work that will take a long time. It took how many hundreds of years to get here? It's going to take us a little while to get past it. But we want to make sure that whatever it is that we engage in from the standpoint of workforce equity to try to meet that definition that we shared with you. what prompted this anti-harassment project, anti-harassment, anti-discrimination? These are actual headlines from the paper. Shortly before Jenny Durkin as mayor came into the position of mayor, there was an outcry from our employees that said, we have so much harassment and discrimination going on in the city and no one is paying any attention, no one is listening. We're paying out hundreds of thousands of dollars to settle claims. And it was a Me Too movement, you know, the Time magazine talking about the silence breakers. We ended up within the city with a group called the Seattle Silence Breakers. This was the thing that Mayor Durkin was walking into. And obviously on the heels of the last mayor who left early because not a good look. So the mayor was devoted to making sure that we did something about some of the things that were happening. And so we actually then, we got a request from the mayor as well as council member Teresa Mosqueda that said, I want you to pull together an interdepartmental team from all over the city. And you have, get this, 10 weeks to provide us recommendations to improve anything to do with anti-harassment, anti-discrimination in the areas of training. That means updating or changing or adding any training that we have. Reporting mechanisms, how people report, because some of that outcry was about I report and nothing happens. I never hear anything, don't know what's going on. And also our personnel rules, which most people call policies. So these are personnel rules that, Personnel Rule 1.1, anti-harassment and anti-discrimination. That's based very much on legal definitions of harassment and discrimination. And we'll talk more about that, but while we all know that most of the problems don't rise to the level of illegal harassment or illegal discrimination, but it has to do with how people are treating each other in the workplace.
So this was a big ask. And so Felecia graciously asked me if I would help facilitate the group in the process of working. We'll say IDT a lot. It's essentially a citywide team that represents a lot of departments. And so I feel like this represented me a little bit at the moment of, will you be willing to do this? She did give me a day to think about it, but there was no backup plan. Had I said, I don't know, I'm going to pass. I didn't pass, and so this is what I felt like a little bit, and I just want to share this because sometimes when we're in this work, people assume you know it all. Oh, you do equity, you have diversity in your title, oh my gosh, you represent women of color, folks of color, I'm going to grab you. And so, but yeah, it's a stressful moment when you are asked to take on an initiative as big as harassment and discrimination. As Felecia said, it's taken years to create all of this. It's embedded in our culture and our systems. And so I just like to share, I went to the people that I hold close in my life to really find out, putting my soul into this work and not wanting to do harm and re-traumatize folks in the process. So I called my mom and my sister, which are the closest people in my life, and they reminded me, which you sometimes need these reminders, why not you? Because you care, and you know that you're going to do things that other people may not see. So if anything, you should ask why. Instead of asking why you and why should you be doing this work, it's why not you. And so I'm gracious to, with that process, I did say yes to Felecia that I would embark on this journey with her. And we knew that we did not have a template for this work. It was going to be really something that we needed to look at differently.
I thought this one was yours. Okay, center most impacted. So this morning they talked a little bit about who's on the margins of society. Those people that are on the margins of society are generally the ones that are most impacted by things like, or any kinds of oppression, racism, sexism, ableism. Those are the people who are most impacted. And as we went into this work, we knew that if we were not hearing from those who were most impacted, if we were not hearing from those women and women of color who had been complaining about things going on in the city for all those years, that this would be, the reason to do this and doing this work would be basically useless. There was a time, I have to admit, that we were asked by the mayor's office, well, can't you just get 3 or 4 people in a room and write up some recommendations? Seriously. And we were like, if we believe that to do equity work, you need to hear from those most impacted, there's no way that we can just sit in a room and write up recommendations. Yes, we could. And it could be that we end up with some of the same things that we ended up with anyway, but it also could be that we miss something really important if we do that. And so the whole time we were going through this process, it was always going back again and again and again, who was most impacted by this work. And as we'll see with some statistics a little later, which we already knew, it was women and women of color in particular. And so that is what we kept at front of mind as we moved through this.
So in engaging in this work, we started to scramble. We knew we had 10 weeks, which means it was already gone, and it was already fleeting really quickly, and we had to bring a team together that we had not yet identified and create a process that we didn't know what we were going to do. And I do feel lucky enough that I work with and for a person who was essentially, do what you gotta do. If we need to ask for money, if we need to ask for certain kind of resources, just let me know what you need. And so on the back end, we knew we wanted to embed equity, race, and social justice. We knew we wanted to utilize the anti-racist principles, which I will share with you a little bit later. And we also wanted to make sure that everybody in the room was on a baseline understanding about the topic, because we all come in at different levels and understand the process. We wanted to uproot what the current concerns were of our employees, because all those articles were just a little bit of information that there is something going on and we needed to find out more. We needed to determine project needs. We needed, in my mind, backwards timeline, so we knew when the result was needed to go to the mayor's office and council and when they wanted it, so that we could get everybody from their jobs to do the amount of time that we needed from this commitment for the project. And we also needed to involve key partners and identify who those people are, how power is in the room, because we do work in a political system, and what that means. We also needed participant commitment, and we needed to find a way of what would it look like to involve stakeholders. So that's a lot to think about really quickly, and we did do this, I would say, really fast, and we kept pushing up against the 10-week timeline and kept asking for more time, but we ended up getting a little bit more at the end, but we had to stay to that 10 weeks. And so in that process, I'd just like to share, if you can hold that up, Felecia. So since I was given the leeway to kind of go with this, I created this is how my brain works. And so what I created was a chart for me to think of strategy. And so I knew, it's very long, and so I knew that, okay, if we need to get this work and we need to start with foundations, we need to get rooted together when we bring this team together. And so I started to identify really what are the focus areas that people needed to learn. And then I started to actually timeline, okay, this is just day one of a 3-day intensive that we'll talk a little bit about. But how many hours then would I have to do that work with them? What are the outcomes that I wanted them to get from that activity or that learning? And then what are the possibilities? Who are my partners that I could bring in to do presentations, to connect us with different learnings? And what would that look like? And then on the right-hand side, what is all the preparation work that this group would need to know in order to engage in this work? So one of the things is reading the personnel rules. It's long, it's boring, and people probably only look at it when they have a legal concern and want to get a problem fixed. And it's big, and it's very legalistic. And so that's what's happening nationally. We were lucky to have the EEOC information and report to start from, but knowing that we wanted to have that racial equity lens, which a lot of the data and information doesn't have that's currently out and available. So I started to essentially pull it all together so I could mentally get my mind around it, so then I can help and work with the group through that process.
So stakeholders. This was a very interesting interdepartmental team. That's IDT, interdepartmental team. It was the most interesting one I've ever been a part of in my 13 years at the city because it included labor representatives, it included someone from law, it included HR folks, it included the city investigator, it included a member of the council staff, it included a member of the mayor's staff, and it included representatives from all of those groups that had been speaking out. So it included employees who were mostly individual contributors, who were part of the Seattle Silence Breakers, who were part of a group called the Race and Social Justice Affiliates, which was both employees and community members. It included member from a group, and I never get this name exactly right, but it is an affinity. I mean, it's a group of all the affinity groups in the city. And I want to take a quick side to say that except for a couple of affinity groups that are chartered and sponsored within departments, our citywide affinity groups are loosely held community-built affinity groups. It's people who decide they are going to get together and they are going to come up with recommendations or whatever it is that they're going to do. So it included people from there. There were 21 of us, I think, when we got through, 4 of which were labor reps, 4 of which were employees from some of these groups, and then the varied other people that I talked about. And this is, it's a different and huge undertaking because you have people in the room who don't trust each other at all. This is not a like-minded group. This is a group who comes in and says, HR is terrible, and I don't even know why I'm standing here talking to you, and oh, by the way, you person, oh, and we had people from the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, too. I wanted to put that in there. You know, and every time there's no trust. Every time someone complains, HR, they told us, I heard this so many times, it hurts my heart because I've been in HR for 30 years. Like, you're only there to protect the institution and protect management. And that's who came to the room, and they showed up. And they showed up very vocally.
Mm-hmm. And we knew this. We knew this was going to happen. And we also knew that to get them together, we also needed them to commit to us. And so we did have a rigorous participant commitment for them. And so with the 10-week timeline, we're going to say that a lot.
This was in meetings. This didn't include the work outside.
So yeah, we added up all of this so we could even ask department directors and folks that we needed to of the average time of each participant in addition to their workload. So they needed to make it work was 7 to 13 hours. We know it was a lot more that they ended up doing because you have to research, you have to read, you have to meet with folks. And so Felecia went to a lot of the department directors in the mayor's office and said, if you want us to do this in this 10 weeks, this is what we need from folks.
And don't think we didn't get pushback. And who do you think we got pushback from the most? No. We got the pushback the most from those managers and supervisors of the individual contributors who had been speaking out. They would send me something saying, can't we give you someone else? No. We chose this person for a reason. Or they would come back and say, well, the mayor has this other priority and this person really needs to be working on that priority. Seriously? This is the only person you have in your department that can work on the mayor's other priority? And I thankfully did not have to actually involve having the mayor's office contact them, but it got close. I had some conversations with some HR directors and departments to say, because they saw them as troublemakers. And they're like, why would I want to give, in fact, one of them said to me, why would I want to give them a platform to be able to complain some more? So it was real that we had to really fight to get people into the room, but we needed to have that, and we had full support of the mayor to do that.
So what did we do with convening the team?
Well, first of all, everything we did, as Andrea already talked about, was very intentional. The entire process, setting up the 3-day kickoff. We knew it was going to take a lot of work.
And so we did advocate to get 3 full days with those folks, and so those 21 folks in the room, and we had an email that specifically went out to them to set the stage. And the email that we sent to them was to start to say, when you come to this meeting and when you commit to this, you cannot send substitutions. You need to be there 100% for the full 3 days. You need to be ready to essentially share with the group. And we invited them to share with us. We need to advance the pronouns you use, your preferred name, racially how you identify, so we can start to set the stage for name tense, but also starting to give people little cues within our email that we were going to lead with race and social justice, and so they needed to be prepared to talk about this in those 3 days together. And so this is some of the overview of the elements that we had within the 3-day grounding together. We did also have the mayor and Councilmember Mosqueda come to set the stage with the group, but we had Race and Social Justice Foundations, the anti-racist principles. We came together and had community agreements of how we would work together throughout the process and how we would engage with each other. Listening, we figured out how we were going to listen to employees most impacted and share stories in that grounding. We wanted to understand and account for power in the room and what that would look like for them throughout the process, because as Felecia had shared, we had folks from the mayor's office and the council member's office all the day with other folks that didn't trust those positions and what they were trying to achieve. We also needed to understand the national and local impact of what was happening, because sometimes we need to see the bigger picture of what's happening with the Me Too movement, but also with how we are addressing or not addressing racial harassment and discrimination. Also understanding the reporting process and the personnel rules. And for instance, one of the things that we did a lot of research on is talking about language accessibility. And one of the things we looked at is what grade level are our personnel rules written at? Is there any guesses of what you would guess our personnel rules were written at? Grade level? Just throw one out there. 18? What else? 7, 8, 12. 18 is the closest. It was at 16.5. Think of how much education and learning you need to navigate when you're in need and can't get through the personnel policy. And then we needed to build trust with everybody's experiences, both negative and more negative, most likely. What would it mean to come together as a group so we could share deeply and come to results? And then talking about our hopes and fears of the project openly. So these are some of the elements we included, and then I'm just going to touch on some of the activities and information that we shared. So this is the anti-racist principles that the Race and Social Justice Initiative, but also citywide, this helps guide our work. And these are from Undoing Racism, the People's Institute from Survival and Beyond. So you can access it there. And so these help root a lot of what the work that we were doing. And so I'll just read the topics to you, and I encourage you, if you get the chance, to go check it out and read more. But it talks about the importance of analyzing power, developing leadership, talking about gatekeeping in processes, identifying and analyzing manifestations of racism, learning from history, maintaining accountability, sharing culture, undoing internalized racial oppression, both internalized racial inferiority and internalized racial superiority, and what it means to undo racism. And so a lot of those elements went back to, if we are going to connect something, we need to go back to these elements, so we are intentional of how we're going to look at the big picture. So with that, some of the activities we did, and so we tried to look at it. So a lot of my history and background comes from higher education, working with students at the university level to get to be in spaces with all the university higher ups. And so it has been a lot of me navigating spaces and helping people code switch and understand, learn, develop, and then be ready to go into those conversations. So I pulled a lot of that of how do we make this interactive, but people are also learning, engaging, and we are using every element to go back to the work, that we're not just doing it just to do work. And so these are just some of the activities that I wanted to share today based on time. And I'm going to talk through a little bit of what we did, because there's not too many details. And so one of them was building collective history and having everybody in the room take part and really creating a visual of what is our history in the city and how did we get to this point. So it just wasn't Felecia or the director of OCR sharing what they had in their experience and telling people what the history, we were involving and building history together. So the silence breakers could say what history that they have experienced in the city and what they're seeing from employees. So the Coalition Against Anti-Racism in the city, they could talk about the letter that they sent to the previous administration and the previous HR director about racial discrimination and harassment that wasn't addressed. So people could really build this together. The labor relations folks could come in and talk about the different topics that they are trying to negotiate and help people that they represent navigate through the city. And then what we're seeing nationally and how it all connects, that this trauma is everywhere and we are not unique in experiencing it, but we're gonna try to be unique in trying to address it. And so that really helps set the foundation for people to share everything in their hearts and minds before we went into some of the work of, okay, now where do we go from here? And so that was done really with having people share, all 21 folks, and charting everything so people could see it. And I will say in this entire process, we had some great volunteers of staff who took notes on everything the entire time so that we could go back to this information and bring it back to the group so they could reflect and look at what was brought up during this process. The testimony, so some of the silence breakers went to council and shared testimony of their experiences of harassment in the workplace, and so that was something that was recorded, as all council hearings are. So we shared that with the group, and we also had a conversation about it, of what the impact was, what do they notice, and what are they hearing, and then how do we center people most impacted throughout the process? What does that look like as a team going into this work, knowing that there are folks who are experiencing this every day, potentially? We also had a gallery of what I like to call bad data, the best available data. Data is not great. We're never going to have enough, and we can always get into this, well, I can't move on until I have this, and I need more here. You work with the best available data. And so we had charts, and there's some over here of what we had, and we just did a gallery of having people set what do you see, what do you notice, what are we missing? And a lot of it, we also did have a huge stack of every article since the previous year that had come out about the city in the news about harassment and discrimination and people's experiences. So having people look through that, it didn't have to be in depth, but really setting the stage of what do we know according to the facts and figures that we have, according to the EEOC, and then how do we bring that and connect it to where we need to learn more and where we need to dive in as a group to do the research. Another activity that created, and we talked about earlier in a lot of the sessions about questioning. And so I'm a big proponent of questioning, and so I created an activity to question the reporting process. And so it looked a little bit of, I diagrammed the entire city process of if someone were to need to make a claim that they have been harassed in the workplace, what would it look like? There wasn't a visual already created, and essentially people are given that 16.5 personnel rule and said, here you go, this is what your path is. And so I met with a city investigator and tried to create a diagram of what it looked like so we could visualize it. And so I had every participant take a large diagram, and there's some sheets that have now fallen off the walls. You can check those out. And so they all got a big paper of it. They got worked in, I think, teams of 4 or 5. And we asked them to essentially have sticky notes and go through the entire process with some intentional questions. And I created some cards with these headings. And so knowledge and understanding, privilege, barriers, impact, power, people, and harm. And on the back of each card were a list of starting questions for people to think of. Felecia, can you read some of the questions?
So for people, who are the stakeholders in the process who is missing? Which stakeholders have additional needs? How might people be further affected by race, ethnicity, gender identity, disability, etc.? How does the current process or policy perpetuate systemic advantages for white employees? And how does the current reporting process, policy, and structure perpetuate disadvantages for employees of color? So for like the harm one, it says, how does this process, policy, or procedure cause harm, and what elements contributed to it? So these are the kind of questions that they, the groups actually went through and tried to answer as they were looking at this.
And for some of them, they were worried that this was just going to be an academic activity. A lot of these questions go back to our Race and Social Justice Initiative. They have a racial equity toolkit where we ask these questions of who is being harmed and what do we know, so we can go at the root of how people are being impacted and how our system is perpetuating that and how it can be addressed. So all of the questions that they came up with, we had a number of lists. We identified to put them into the 3 categories, and 4 being extra if they didn't go into. So training, policy and personnel rules, and then the reporting process. And we had each of those ideas or questions that came up, sort them into each of those 3 categories so that the groups that would be their starting work. They would start to identify how they would change the process, what additional research they needed as a subgroup and subcommittee to focus on those 3 areas. That's a lot. So fast forward to the end of day 2. The group, as we were coming together, we really wanted to have the group connect because we did know there was a lot of different experiences, people who themselves have been through the process of reporting and had a really traumatizing experience in the room. So we asked everybody to share their hope for the process. And we collected all of these and also brought this back throughout. And so I'll share a couple of them. The background actually of this is all the hopes that the group shared. But they really wanted to hold HR responsible. They wanted to really have help in a solution and build that together. They wanted to be able to tell the hard truth of what is happening in the city and be authentic to city employees who are most impacted. And be transparent through the entire process. I know mine for the process is I wanted to make sure that this was not causing harm. Whatever we did was not going to perpetuate harm, but also going to set the stage for the national level, because I do know that people look to the work of the city. And how can people take whatever we're doing and make it better and go out and create change that is going to impact people positively. And so all of this was really the opportunity for people to circle around, but hear the other folks and how we had a shared experience and a shared understanding of where we wanted to move together. Because all of that other experiences they really had to reconnect and not say, these people are all in this journey with me. We are not up against, and I'm not going to have to go to battle every day to make sure the group I represent is being heard. That we really were making space for that and asking them for that through the process.
So before you get the belief that this was all kumbaya and everybody was happy with the thing that came out of the hopes, think about when the people said, we want to be authentic, to be able to go back to our employees and essentially acknowledge that they were being harmed. Who do you think in the room was like, oh, we shouldn't be saying that? The lawyers. More the lawyers than HR, but it was more the lawyers that are like, oh no, we can't say that. That's going to be something that means they can sue us, and So there was a lot of back and forth, and it was, and even though the group did gel and be able to work very well together, there are a couple of times when things got really tense, and I'll share one of those really short stories. So one of the employees, individual contributors, said something about, so how does it happen then that an employee who has been in trouble can be on probation for 5 years? And those of us who were in HR and those of us who were investigators seriously thought she was joking, and we laughed. And the employees in the room, individual contributors, you could see tense up, like this is exactly what I expected to happen. People are going to, you could see it. You could see it and feel it in the body language. And they were like, no, we're serious. It's like, It's impossible. Our personnel rules and our union contracts don't allow someone to be on probation for 5 years. You can extend probation once, and it very seldom happens. So we were really kind of going, you know, first of all, we're really sorry that we upset you, but we're not understanding what's going on. It was actually several weeks later when I was presenting to a group of employees, when someone said something about being on a last chance agreement for 5 years. Think about what that means when you talk probation. Last chance agreements were generally designed that if you were an alcoholic or doing drugs and we kept giving you a chance to go dry out and you kept coming back to work that way, and so finally you will do a last chance agreement that says, if you do it one more time, we're not going through all the processes, you're just out of here. But imagine being put on a last chance agreement because the way you looked at someone or said something got translated into you're a bad person who, you know, that's not the words, that's in the letter, of course. But that's essentially it. And then they don't give you a deadline for when that's over. So now you have this file, this letter in your file that you are on a last chance agreement for 5 years. That is worse than probation. You know, at least in probation, they're supposed to be helping you to learn. This last chance agreement is a chance to say, got you. But imagine those employees sitting there when they said, so maybe we can stop this being on probation for 5 years, and we laughed. So we had our tense moments. We had the things that we really had to pay attention to and to come together. So I just wanted to kind of interject that.
So that was the 3 days. And then we had ongoing meetings for that 10 weeks. And with some of that, I created more tools. So we had regular meetings, and as the commitment everybody involved had subcommittee meetings every week, and we had a large meeting every week with all the groups. And because of time, I was only able to be a part of a large group. But my goal was really to take this as an educational learning opportunity, but also not assuming that everybody knew what was going on. So creating a lot of tools, and I created a lot of tools in a short amount of time. There's this binder behind Felecia that if you can pick up and show. This is just all the stuff that I got and created and did for the foundation to get them started and going. And so some of the things that that we did as a group, but also we did as a team, is we created a foundational approach of how we were going to do this work, but also how we expected whatever the recommendations were to be implemented. And so I'll share that with you shortly. We also did use the power of SharePoint to put every single document. If I created it, if I had it, everybody else had it. There was nothing that nobody else had access to. One, because if I needed to take vacation, they didn't have to search around. But just being transparent so that everybody knew what was out there. I created as many subcommittee templates as you can imagine. I created a backwards timeline of this is what you should be talking about in your subcommittee each week, and whatever else you want to add. But these are things you need to at least get to so we have results by X date so we can deliberate, look at the data, and move from there. I created an equity analysis chart, which I'll talk a little bit about as well, to analyze each of the recommendations they were creating in their groups. We also talked about how do we remain transparent and create an employee communication plan and be able to share what we're doing throughout the process, since there is little transparency in the city. And then at the heart of it is how do we really connect to employees, their stories, and get data of what is truly happening, because we haven't even asked the question. We just know that there are things happening, and we've heard individually, but we really also need to know a bigger picture. So these are a list of the foundational approach that the group that created together. So they decided they didn't want to create a charter. We started that, didn't work.
Didn't work.
And they said, we just want to talk about what at the heart we want to get through this system. And for each of this, it's in the final recommendations. There's a little paragraph about each one. But they wanted to make sure to use anti-racist and anti-racism practices. They wanted to use restorative practices and think about restorative justice, and really what does that look like via just being punitive. They wanted to center those most affected and talking about folks that are most impacted and at the margins and what that looked like in the city. They wanted to work beyond the legal definitions of discrimination and harassment because that's all that we have. There's nothing about bullying, intimidation, and what happens to those everyday things that are happening that are not illegal. They wanted to have accountability measures so they knew progress was being made. They wanted everything to be accessible and transparent, so thinking about grade level 16.5 and no additional resources online. They wanted to improve workplace culture. They wanted to utilize trauma-informed care strategies because the people going through this is constantly being asked to relive their trauma every time they share their story. They wanted to have survivor-centered approaches so that we really know how to work with folks that have experienced this work or this trauma. And they really wanted to center humanity. So as Felecia would say, not really thinking of protecting the institution. This is about people first. This is about remembering that we all have something in this and are connected. And so with that, this is just a screenshot of some of the SharePoint and the documents of what we shared with them of the timeline, but also the strategy chart that really had them essentially ask more questions of each recommendation, and they really unpacked each recommendation they created. So if they were looking at what it meant to have a strategy related to leadership and needing to fund things sufficiently, they couldn't just say we need to fund everything sufficiently so it's up to scale and we have all the investigators we need. They really needed to identify what is sufficiently defined as, who's impacted if we don't do this, or if we do this. So really in their little groups, asking them to look at all of these questions, analyze it, and know if we don't get fully funded or this doesn't move forward, what are the implications of that?
So then we talked about engaging employees. Remember we talked about making sure we heard the voices of those most impacted. So we had to find a way to engage employees largely, on a larger scale, broader scale than just the 4 people who happen to be in our interdepartmental team. And so the city does a race and social justice survey every 2 years, and this happened to be the year it was supposed to be done. But that survey is basically asking questions like, how do you think the city's doing? How do you think your department's doing? And it doesn't really ask a lot of personal questions. And we added to this survey a lot of very specific anti-harassment, anti-discrimination based questions. Really went into asking questions. And so we sent the survey out, and we ended up with 4,231 respondents. We've got about 14,000 people at the city, so we got a really good group of people who actually responded. This is their participation by race. What's interesting is that these numbers are pretty close to our representation in general of who we have in the city. Actually, we probably got more people of color here who responded than we usually have in the city. But we also captured as well as we could gender identity, and we didn't break them out about what those were. But with 30% of the employees responding, we thought we had a pretty good idea of what was going on. So what did we find out? 34% of respondents had experienced or observed acts of harassment or discrimination in the workplace. 34%. And of those 34%, 80% of them said, I never told a soul. I never reported it. I never let anyone know what had gone on. The percent of respondents that do not believe management consistently demonstrates support for a workplace free of harassment, don't believe management's doing their job, 30% women of color said, I don't believe you're doing your job. 25% of white women don't believe you're doing your job. That's because they're the ones that's experiencing the harm. Then the percent of respondents that agree that management gives fair and equal treatment to all employees regardless of race. White men, 83%. Yeah, we're doing good. What's really interesting is you look at these, and as we shared these out, you know what kind of responses we got? Well, that's only 34% of them, so all the rest of them must be fine. Do you think it's acceptable for 34% of your employees to have observed or experienced discrimination or harassment? But that is exactly the words that I got when I took it to different leadership groups. But we don't talk about all of those who didn't have any problems. Is that an all lives matter thing? I don't know. Bottom line is that the bottom line is that we had problems. We knew we had problems. I would rather quit than do a formal intervention. I've been in the same department 5 years, and the culture of my environment has been harassment on multiple levels and occasions. I sought assistance through mediation, union stewards and reps, spoken with management. Nothing has ever happened. The behavior continues, happens primarily to people of color, primarily to women of color. And when your leadership is the issue, you don't have anywhere else to go. So those are the kinds of things we heard, and I want to take just a minute to read to you something that was sent to the IDT. It's a letter. It says, "Thank you for the invitation to share our personal stories of mistreatment in the city workplace. We are the Seattle Silence Breakers, a group of city employees and supporters who are committed to expose and eradicate systemic injustices in our workplaces. We have directly experienced and challenged workplace mistreatment, harassment, and/or discrimination. However, we have not been able to voice and share our experiences due to the fear of retaliation and/or due to legal constraints. And therefore, we have compiled our individual personal stories and woven these into a single story which includes the diverse types of mistreatment while protecting our identities. These are all true and objective facts about the city workplace environment. We hope you will read and hear our story with the spirit of an ally and the lens of compassion. With gratitude and respect, the Seattle Silence Breakers." Hello, I would like to introduce myself. I am currently a City of Seattle employee. I am resigned or retired from the city, or I am a forced to resign or forced to retire from the city individual. I identify as female. I am writing my story anonymously because I fear retaliation on the job or because I am legally bound to silence on this topic due to the city's requirement for my complaint settlement. I, along with dozens of others, speak as one today. This is a compilation of multiple individual stories which are true and factual experience of city employees that have been shared anonymously within the Seattle Silence Breakers group. I am a blue-collar worker, a white-collar worker, a manager, a planner, an administrative professional, a laborer, an engineer, a line worker, an IT technician. I am from all job classifications within the city, and I work in all city departments. I work directly with customers providing city services. I manage a city department. I work on a crew outdoors. I supervise multiple employees within a division. I am a frontline non-supervisor employee. I am at all levels of responsibility within the city. I'm going to jump to another part of this that talks about, did I file a complaint? Here are some reasons why I did not file a complaint at any agency. I felt very, very unsafe and knew that if I did file, things would get worse. The daily mistreatment had been going on for years, and I had tried the in-house channels and my conflict resolution skills, and nothing worked, which caused serious health problems, so I just decided to leave the city. I could not afford the time, the money, emotional resources it would take to identify research procedures and or to compile all documentation. I have or had other better and safer job opportunities outside the city and changed my employment. When I did choose to file a complaint, I did so through my HR department, my union, the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, and or the State Human Rights Commission. One or more of these agencies either denied my complaint, never got back to me after 2 years with the denial, or settled the complaint with a financial offer, a denial of any wrongdoing by the perpetrators, no negative consequence to the perpetrator or offender, and a legal requirement that I leave the city, never to work for any city job again, and not to speak about details of the settlement. What happened to those who mistreated me? They were promoted, paid administrative leave, administrative leave, you know what that is? We're looking into an investigation. The person who supposedly done wrong is sitting at home getting paid full time, doing nothing for months, literally months. Allowed to retire early, they did find something. Given merit pay, given my job when I left, or assigned to a better job in another city department. How has this mistreatment affected me personally, professionally, and financially? Professionally, once I raised my voice against the mistreatment, my performance appraisals were lowered. I was denied merit raises or promotion. I was assigned to work tasks which prevented me from developing further my skill bank, and or I could not get professional recommendations from my department so that I can get other employment. Personally, this workplace mistreatment led to a very high level of stress, which resulted in depression, anxiety-related disorders, breast cancer, exasperation of autoimmune diseases, etc. Finally, I was forced to resign or retire earlier than I had planned, which consequently reduced my income, retirement, Social Security options, and ability to get another job. Sad but true, due to the above experiences, I can no longer recommend my friends and communities to work for the city. Those are some of the stories. Compilation of some of the stories that we heard. The themes: mistrust of HR, mistrust of management, fear of retaliation, lack of transparency. Nobody knows what's happening with their complaints when they complain. Lack of awareness of reportable offenses. Some people don't even know what they can report. Racial and gender bias in hiring and promotion. Ageism. That one actually came up and surprised us. We had a lot of people talk about ageism, and it wasn't something that we had even really considered. And it's because as the people are getting older, some of the young managers are essentially saying, aren't you ready to retire? Why don't you leave? You know? Lack of trust, abuse of power, lack of accountability. That's a question I get asked all the time. But if my manager doesn't do anything when the supervisor does it, what can I do? And my answer is not much. If they're not being held accountable, there's not much that can be done if it doesn't reach the level of illegal harassment or discrimination. Lack of consistency, people get treated different ways, differential treatment of people of color, lack of confidentiality. People said when they went to HR or even to sometimes alternative dispute resolution, they felt like people were telling others in their work group about what was going on. No resolution or lack of resolution, a long time before you get any answer is normal. Lack of urgency, and that they never center racial equity.
So with that, we took all of that data and developed final recommendations. And so the group were able to utilize all of it from the survey and the focus groups conducted. And they gave, they were asked for 3 categories of recommendations. They created, I think, 6. And so they had a total of 35 recommendations, and under each recommendations, there was a total of 125 strategies. With the area for more work and areas for future consideration, because they knew, we ended up getting 12 weeks, so 2 extra, that this was not enough time to do this work sufficiently, and more needed to be done.
And we do have some copies of what is just our kind of handout about what happened with or what recommendations and things, and some of the background for how we put them together. And there should be enough copies if you want to take one. And it also has here the website. All of this is available. It is out there for the world to see. We know we've got a long way to go. The thing I did not say is that in addition to the RSJ survey, we also held some employee focus groups. So we actually had someone contracted in so they didn't have to mistrust HR or the Office for Civil Rights or anyone else to come and just ask them questions and let them give us information about what was going on. So some of the quotes that you saw was actually from those focus groups as opposed to the survey. But we wanted to make sure we got the voices of those who were most impacted. And what has essentially happened is that after this was delivered to the mayor and council, there was an executive order that basically laid out some things that, and I always say this and probably gets me in trouble every time, budget is policy. So it laid out the things that they were willing to pay for us to start doing some work towards this. And one of the things that actually didn't cost anything but came up repeatedly is that there were no citywide values or expectations in place. And so if you went from department to department, those things look very different. And that was one of the complaints employees had, that, you know, it's different in every department you're in. So we just, or the mayor just rolled out yesterday, the citywide workplace values and expectations that we are going to use to, with our performance evaluations and with all of our training and those kinds of things. And there are some other things on the executive order, but truthfully, the work and what we wanted to talk about was the process of how we got here and what it took to get that group of very diverse people in thought, in trust, and all kinds of things to come up with something that the mayor could actually use. The IDT lives on. It's not over. We use them for advice. They, you know, reviewed the workplace values and expectations before it went out. Training, they'll be part of training curriculum as we put that together. It's the other things.
They're everything.
Pretty much.
This is my work right now, so yeah, it's going to definitely, we're also figuring out how do we roll it out and make sure everybody knows what it means and how do you live it and how does it inform the development and revision of policy.
We're about at our time.
Yes, we're almost at our
questions.
time.
Any kind of questions? What we learned there's no one way to do anything. And we learned that you really do need to get people into a room. They have to experience each other in ways enough to begin to build trust. That is very hard. We tell people all the time to do equity work, you got to do your internal work first. We saw it show up. We saw power show up in the room. We saw privilege show up in the room, and at times really had to shut it down. And I'll never forget the time the one person was writing and everyone in the little small group was saying, here's what they think is important. And as soon as somebody said something about race, the person stopped writing. And I'm like, why aren't you writing? Well, I don't know how to write that, and handed over the pen and walked away. This was someone with a lot of power and a lot of privilege. And so it is something that you have to navigate the entire time you are in those spaces. It is not easy to do. And it takes a lot of courage. What else did we learn?
And I would say we had a great opportunity of learning too. There were some folks that did show up with their power and privilege and started doing all the talking and taking up space, and we were able to revert some of that. And towards the end of getting to reflection, we saw how that person developed and like really saw what the impact of that was. And towards the end said, I saw that how I show up as a white woman, sometimes I just need to sit and listen. So everybody had learning and developing through that process. We have learning and development through that process, and it was for the first time of being supported that I did not just feel like a facilitator going in. There were moments when we were in the deliberation of figuring out recommendations and getting folks to actually prioritize. They wanted everything. Everything. But 125 strategies, 35 recommendations, we had to prioritize. It took us up until the very last day. But there was one day where I had said, I don't know what to do with you all from here. I need some recommendations from you because you're not moving and we need to move. And when you ask for help from the group and know you're not the authority, that you're in it together, people show up. We even had folks ask us, and still do now that we're moving into results, asking of the core leadership. There's been 4 of us. Us as well as 2 folks from the Office of Civil Rights, their director and one of their staff members. And we're all women of color. And we had folks from the group say, as women of color doing this work in an institution, what support do you need from us? The first time I was asked that question from the group, I was just taken aback because nobody's ever asked me that. I felt alone in the work. I felt that we had to get to a result, and it was my responsibility, even if nobody shows up to that work group. But for the first time in a lot of work, we were in this together 100%, and I could say we still feel like we're in it together.
So anything we can answer for you?
We have time probably for 1, maybe 2 questions. Yes?
So you just mentioned something that just really took my interest just now. So you have 6 women that are, I guess, that are color that are replacing?
4.
4? You're all women of color?
They're not going to say it out loud. They might be thinking it, but they're not going to say it out loud. I think that because this particular project was so strongly sponsored by the mayor and council, that we did not get as much of that. But as I said, when I showed up in spaces and talked about what we learned, it's, well, what about all these people who are okay? So you got that kind of response, but we didn't really get a, I'm not listening to you because you're all women of color type thing.
Well, and I think also the fear of working on harassment and discrimination work, what are they going to say? They don't have the answer. We're the ones willing to do the work and willing to make the mistakes in the work. And so sometimes it is, well, let's go to the people doing the work with anti-harassment. Not my turn. So.
But do you find, I'm sorry to repeat that question, so do you find though that people may form their own story, a narrative around that if you don't have people that are not people of color in your group? Does it make it hard to be believable, I guess is what I'm saying? Because if it's about race and equity in that place, there's not a lot there if everybody is a person of color.
No, everyone in the group was not a person of color by any stretch. It just happened to be that the four of us who were the core team to move it forward, who had the job of the logistical actually making it happen, we were all women of color. But the bottom line is that the group itself, you better believe all those labor reps were not women of color. You know, so we actually, and the attorneys, and so we actually had a diverse group. That was part of what we did when we put it together, was to make sure that there was a diversity also of the size of our departments, the type of work that they did, definitely gender and race. So we did have quite a diverse group in the 21 that did the work.
And they were all on message in those different forums. So we did have white folks to show up in those spaces in their roles, whether it was with union, the city investigator, whatever that looked like for them. We were all on message because we did this work together. So it just wasn't the four of us sharing. Everybody was sharing the same. And we did that with, we had community feedback sessions with employees, and the entire group, a lot of them volunteered to share their experience so that employees could hear from them versus us. We have 1 minute left, so we have to wrap up for recording in time. But if you have questions for us and want to connect with us after, we will stay and leave that space for you. You can also contact us. The handouts are at the ends of the table, but thank you everybody for being so amazing.
Thank you so much.
And for being here. And thank you for all the work you do.